Good evening, everyone. I hope you all had a most blessed day. It's time for your daily Bible verse, and tonight we're going to read Hebrews chapter 5, verses 11 through 14. We have much to say about this, but it is hard to explain because you are slow to learn. In fact, though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you the elementary truths of God's Word all over again. You need milk, not solid food. Anyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is not acquainted with the teaching about righteousness. But solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. What this is talking about, the writer of Hebrews here is saying, and if you ask me, it was Paul. I believe he wrote Hebrews. But regardless, it's saying, we have much to say about this, Christ's eternal priesthood in the order of Melchizedek, But what it's saying, it's hard to explain because you are so slow to learn, You're not progressing forward, Instead of progressing, you're being spiritually sluggish, lazy, You're drinking spiritual milk. In fact, though, by this time you ought to be teachers, teaching people, educating people. You need someone to teach you the elementary truths of God's Word all over again. You need milk, not solid food. Let me just say, there are a lot of Christians that are suckling spiritual milk. Nobody gets into the meat of God's Word. Nobody ever bothers to pull a nice T-bone steak once in a while. Sit down at the table, get themselves a nice T-bone steak and eat that. Get into God's Word further. Nobody wants to learn further. Nobody wants to grow in their faith. They're happy being baby Christians, I see that all too often, and it's sad. And it's saying you need milk, not solid food, And let me just say, there are plenty of pastors, too, that are sucking spiritual milk, too, and feeding it to their congregation. That's problematic. Anyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is not acquainted with the teaching about righteousness, You don't know discernment. You don't know enough to get you through, You only know basics. Don't get me wrong, we all started as baby Christians, but those of us who progress and grow forward, we get more discernment on the way. But solid food is for the mature who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. We've learned discernment. Y'all have a blessed night. Jesus loves you.